You really think a man who let his whole crew burn to death can protect you? Pregnant and abandoned in a terrifying blizzard, she's rescued by a giant recluse. But she soon discovers her savior is haunted by the ghosts of a fiery tragedy, and his greatest enemy lives right next door. When her own ruthless past tracks her down, they must face a grim truth. Can two broken souls protect each other, or will they both be consumed by the flames? The snow didn't fall. It flew sideways, a horizontal blizzard that scoured the Montana landscape and erased the world. For Clara Reyes, the world had shrunk to the frosted glass of a bus stop shelter, a fragile box against the rising howl of the wind. 8 months pregnant, her hands were a desperate prayer over the swell of her belly, the only source of warmth in the biting cold. Her companion was a worn cello case leaning against the bench, a silent, elegant refugee from a life that no longer existed. The bus, a wounded beast with its hazard lights blinking feebly, had surrendered to the storm hours ago. Hope was a dying ember. Then, 2 beams of light cut through the white chaos. They weren't the bright, sterile LEDs of a modern vehicle, but the weary, yellow eyes of an old pickup truck that seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. It crunched to a halt, the engine a low grumble that was felt more than heard. The door opened and a man emerged, a figure so large he seemed to block out what little remained of the dying light. He moved with a purpose that defied the storm, his steps sure-footed on the slick ground. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and a face that looked like it had been hammered out of granite and regret. His eyes, when they met hers, weren't unkind, but they held a weariness that went bone deep. He didn't waste breath on questions. "Bus ain't going nowhere," he stated, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. He surveyed her condition, the swollen belly, the thin coat, the trembling that shook her entire frame. "My truck's warm. Cabin's warmer." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, born of grim necessity. Clara could only nod, the cold having stolen her words. He gathered her small bag and then, with surprising gentleness, reached for the cello case. He handled it with a respect that startled her, securing it in the truck bed as if it were precious. When he turned back to help her, his large, calloused hand offered a steady anchor in the swirling snow. As she took it, her sleeve caught on the rough cuff of his jacket. He reached to steady her, his own sleeve pulling up just an inch, and she saw it. Licking up his forearm from beneath the worn fabric was a scar, a terrible, jagged landscape of raised, whitened skin that twisted like a lightning strike. It was the mark of a fire, a ghost of some past inferno seared into his flesh. He pulled his sleeve down quickly, his face unreadable. But in that fleeting moment, Clara knew this silent giant wasn't just running from the storm. He was carrying a fire of his own. Eli's cabin was less a home and more a fortress against the world. He led her inside, the scent of pine and wood smoke clinging to the air. Everything was built of hand-hewn logs, solid and severe. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Iron pots hung in graduated sizes above a wood stove, and a single rifle rested on a rack above the door. There were no photographs, no decorations. Every object served a purpose. This was a place built for endurance, not for living. Without a word, he stoked the embers in the fireplace until they roared back to life, the sudden warmth a shocking comfort against Clara's frozen skin. He gestured to a sturdy wooden chair, then moved to the stove where a pot of something simmered. He ladled a thick, hearty soup into a ceramic bowl and set it on the small table in front of her. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He simply provided. Clara ate in silence, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away the last of the storm's chill. She watched him move about the small space, his massive frame navigating the furniture with a practiced, almost silent grace. He was a ghost in his own home, a guardian of a silence he had clearly cultivated for years. He prepared a small back room for her, the bed covered with a simple heavy wool blanket. "It's warm," he said, his first full sentence since the roadside. "You'll be safe here." She murmured her thanks, her voice sounding foreign in the quiet cabin. As she lay down, the exhaustion of the day finally claimed her, pulling her into a heavy, dreamless sleep. But later, in the dead of night, a sound ripped through the silence. A man's voice, raw with terror. "Hold fast." "Hold the line!" Clara sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The voice came again from the main room. It was Eli. "The fire's coming. It's crowning." She crept to the door, peering through a crack. By the faint glow of the dying fire, she saw him. He was tangled in his blankets on a cot, his body rigid, his face contorted in a mask of agony. He was no longer in the cabin. He was trapped somewhere else, in a roaring inferno of memory. For the first time, Clara saw the true depth of the wound behind the scar, the raging fire this man was forced to fight every single night. Morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a slow, pearly grey light filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a profound, muffling silence. Eli was already gone, a stack of freshly cut firewood sitting by the door as the only evidence he'd been there. The scent of coffee hung in the air, a small, unspoken kindness. After the terror of his nightmare, the quiet felt heavier than before, thick with things unsaid and horrors unseen. Clara knew she couldn't break it with words. Words were useless here, but she had another language. She unlatched the worn clasps of her cello case. The instrument's deep, polished wood seemed to glow in the dim light, a relic of another world. Settling onto the hard wooden chair, she drew the bow across the strings, the first note, tentative, fragile. She chose a piece by Bach, a sarabande, that had been her companion through her own darkest nights. It was a melody of profound sorrow, but woven within it was a stubborn thread of hope, a testament to the beauty that survives in broken places. The music was a living thing in the silent cabin. It coiled around the hand-hewn beams, softened the hard edges of the room, and pushed back against the crushing weight of solitude that defined the space. For the first time since she'd arrived, the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a shelter. Through the window, she could see Eli at the edge of the woods, his axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm as he split logs. He stopped mid-swing, his body freezing as the notes reached him across the snow-covered clearing. He stood motionless, a statue of arrested violence, listening. Clara closed her eyes, pouring all her gratitude, all her fear, all her fragile hope into the music. She was offering him the only piece of her soul she had left to give. The final note hung in the air, vibrating with a heartbreaking purity. The cabin door creaked open. Eli stood on the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the frame, but the look on his face shattered her. It wasn't awe or peace. It was a raw, unshielded agony, as if the music had been a physical blow. "Turn it off," he rasped, his voice thick with a pain that was terrifying to behold. He took a staggering step inside. "Please." The silence in the truck on the way to town was heavier than a Montana winter. Eli drove with his eyes fixed on the narrow, plowed road, his jaw set like stone. After his reaction to the music, Clara hadn't dared to speak, the cello in the truck bed now feeling less like a comfort and more like a weapon she had unwittingly used against him. They needed supplies, essentials for her and the baby that his Spartan existence couldn't provide. The town of Hope's Landing appeared in the valley below them, a handful of buildings huddled together against the vast, snow-covered landscape. Their arrival on Main Street caused a quiet ripple. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations on the boardwalk paused. It was clear the townspeople were accustomed to Eli Vance being a ghost, a shadow on the edge of their community. To see him emerge from his mountain exile, a heavily pregnant stranger at his side, was an event. Eli seemed oblivious, or perhaps he had simply learned to wear their stares like a second coat. He helped Clara down from the truck, his hand a brief impersonal weight at her elbow, and led her into the mercantile. The store smelled of oiled wood floors, coffee beans, and leather. A stout man behind the counter nodded, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Eli, been a while." "Cal," Eli acknowledged, handing him a short, precise list. As the storekeeper gathered the items, a woman entered, the bell above the door jangling sharply. She was in her late 60s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face etched with a grief that had long since hardened into judgment. She moved with an unyielding dignity that commanded the room's attention. Her eyes fell first on Clara, a flicker of something that looked almost like pity in their depths. Then they settled on Eli, and they turned to ice. Clara felt the air grow cold. The woman ignored them, placing a small bag of flour on the counter. But as she turned to leave, she stopped, her gaze locking with Eli's across the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the quiet store like a shard of glass. "You have no right to shelter anyone, Eli Vance," she said, her words clear and cold. "Not after what happened to my husband on that mountain." The drive back to the cabin was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Martha Caldwell's words hung between them, colder than the frozen air. Clara looked at the stoic man beside her, at the hands gripping the steering wheel, and knew she couldn't live in the shadow of that accusation. She had to know what fire he was running from. When they were halfway up the mountain road, she broke the silence, her voice quiet but firm. "Eli, what did she mean? That woman in the store?" He didn't answer at first. The truck slowed, crunching to a stop in the middle of the empty road. He stared through the windshield at the snow-laden pines, but his eyes were seeing something else entirely, a different forest, a different season. "Her name is Martha," he said finally, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "Her husband was Dave Caldwell. He was my captain." Clara waited, sensing that any interruption would shatter this fragile opening. "5 years ago," he began, his gaze still fixed on the past. "The Grizzly Creek fire. You might have seen it on the news. It burned for 2 months. We were smoke jumpers, a crew of 12. We were dropped into a bad spot, but we were holding the line." He paused, swallowing hard. The wind shifted. A blowout. It came up the canyon like a freight train. A wall of fire. He fell silent, the memory too vast for words. Clara could almost feel the heat, smell the smoke. "We deployed our shelters," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the last resort. You get inside, you pray." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw desolation in his eyes made her breath catch. "When it passed, I was the only one who came out. Dave. Captain Caldwell. He went back for the FNG, the rookie. Neither of them made it." Back at the cabin, he moved like a man in a trance. He walked to a heavy wooden footlocker at the end of his cot, a piece of military surplus. Unlocking it, he lifted the lid and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he unwrapped it. It was a photograph, its edges soft with time. He handed it to her without a word. It was his crew. 12 young men, grinning under a bright summer sky, their faces smudged with soot and alive with a reckless vitality. She found Eli in the back, younger, leaner, a genuine smile on his face. She looked at the 11 other smiling faces, at the easy brotherhood captured in that single, sun-bleached moment. And she finally understood. Eli wasn't just living with a memory, he was living with the ghosts of 11 brothers. The weight of Eli's confession settled over the cabin, a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. For Clara, the emotional toll of the past few days, the abandonment, the storm, the confrontation in town, and now this devastating revelation, finally caught up with her. It began as a deep, unshakable chill in her bones, a weariness that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. By nightfall, she was shivering violently beneath a mountain of wool blankets, her skin radiating a dangerous heat. Eli found her just after midnight, her breathing shallow and ragged. He placed a calloused hand on her forehead, and his stoic calm instantly evaporated, replaced by a focused, professional urgency. The medic inside the smoke jumper took over. "You're burning up," he said, his voice low and steady, designed to cut through her rising panic. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a metal case, a field medical kit, meticulously organized. He worked with a practiced efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. He took her vitals, his fingers pressing gently against the pulse point in her neck, his eyes counting her breaths. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, his touch impersonal yet infinitely gentle. He coaxed her to drink water from a tin cup he held to her lips, his commands soft but firm. "Just a little. You're dehydrated." He was no longer just her reluctant host. He was a lifeline, a guardian fighting back the darkness that threatened to consume her. Through the haze of fever, Clara was vaguely aware of his constant presence, a large, solid shadow in the flickering lamplight. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a chaotic storm of past and present. She was back in New York, the strings of her cello feeling like chains, the applause of the crowd sounding like judgment. She felt a hand on hers, large and warm, and she flinched, a whimper escaping her lips. In her delirium, she clutched the hand, her eyes squeezed shut as she fought a ghost from another life. "Julian," she breathed, the name a poisoned whisper in the quiet room. "Don't. Please, don't." Eli froze, the cloth in his hand stilling. His gaze sharpened, and a new, harder look settled on his face. He looked down at the terrified woman in the bed, and finally understood. The fire she was running from wasn't a memory. It had a name. Clara awoke to the smell of pine and the quiet crackle of the fire. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She saw Eli sitting in the chair across the room, his head slumped against his chest, asleep. A rifle lay across his lap. He hadn't just watched over her. He had stood guard. The gesture spoke more than any words he could have offered. When he stirred, his eyes immediately found hers, checking her with a practiced gaze. "Fever's gone," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Later, as she sipped a weak broth he'd made, he spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "Last night, in your sleep, you said a name." He let the statement hang in the air, giving her the space to ignore it. But in the quiet safety of the cabin, with this scarred man who had shown her his own ghosts, Clara felt the truth begging for release. "Julian Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was my fiancé." She told him everything, the words spilling out in a quiet, halting rush. She spoke of her life in New York, the concert halls, the rising fame, and then Julian's entrance. He hadn't courted her. He had acquired her, seeing her talent as another asset for his collection. He suffocated her with gifts while systematically cutting her off from her friends and colleagues, chipping away at her confidence until her world consisted of only him and her music, a music he wanted to control. "When I told him I was pregnant," she continued, her hands cradling her belly, "he was furious. It wasn't part of his plan." His plan, she explained, was for her to take a year off, hidden away to have the child. His family would raise it. She would be paid handsomely and sent away, her connection to her own baby severed forever. When I refused, he told me he would ruin me, that he would make it so I could never play again, that no one would ever believe me. And so she had run, with nothing but her cello and her child. Eli listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask. But Clara saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, saw his hands clench into fists on his knees. When she finished, he simply nodded. He stood up and walked over to a small laptop connected to a satellite dish outside. His fingers, surprisingly nimble, moved across the keyboard. After a few moments, he turned the screen toward her. It was an article from a business journal, a profile on Julian Croft. The photo showed a handsome, smiling man in an expensive suit, but the text described his business dealings with words like hostile, ruthless, and a reputation for complete and total victory. Eli's face was grim. The threat wasn't just a memory of a bad man. It was a predator with near-limitless resources, and he was hunting for her. The knowledge of Julian's pursuit settled a new kind of chill in the cabin, a fear that had nothing to do with the weather, but a more immediate danger was gathering. The next morning, Clara woke with a splitting headache, and her hands and feet were swollen, her rings cutting into her flesh. When she tried to stand, spots danced in her vision, and a wave of nausea sent her reeling. Eli saw it instantly. He took one look at her face, then her swollen ankles, and the professional focus snapped back into his eyes, sharper and more urgent than before. He took her blood pressure with a cuff from his medical kit, his face growing grimmer with each pump of the bulb. "Your pressure's too high," he said, his voice tight, dangerously high. He recognized the signs: preeclampsia. It was a silent killer that his limited supplies couldn't fight. They needed a doctor, a hospital. Now. He moved to the shortwave radio in the corner, the cabin's only link to the outside world, and flicked it on. Nothing but a hiss of static answered him. He worked the dials, his movements growing more frantic. But the storm had done its work, snapping a wire or knocking down a repeater on the mountain. They were cut off, utterly and completely isolated. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of Clara's vision. She saw Eli stand motionless, staring at the dead radio. She saw the despair in the set of his broad shoulders, a helplessness that was more terrifying than any anger. He was a man used to fighting, to acting, but this was a battle he couldn't win alone. He looked from the radio to Clara, then to the snow-covered window that faced west. A decision hardened in his eyes, a choice that was clearly agonizing. "Stay here," he ordered, pulling on his heavy jacket. "Don't move." He was out the door before she could ask, the engine of his truck roaring to life, spitting defiance at the oppressive silence. He drove not down the mountain toward town, but on a smaller, less traveled track that wound over the neighboring ridge. It was a journey of only a few miles, but Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, It was the hardest journey of his life. The chapter ended on Martha Caldwell's porch. Eli stood before the door of the woman who despised him, his hat in his hands, snow melting on his shoulders. For the first time in 5 years, he was facing his judge, stripped of his pride, beaten not by fire, but by his fear for the woman and child in his care. He knocked, and when Martha opened the door, her face a mask of cold surprise, he spoke, his voice cracking with a humility he thought he'd lost long ago. "Martha, please. It's not for me. It's for her and the baby. You're the only one close enough to help." Martha Caldwell stared at the giant of a man on her porch, his plea hanging in the frozen air between them. For a long moment, 5 years of bitterness warred with a lifetime of frontier pragmatism. Her face was an unreadable mask of stone, and Eli braced himself for the slam of the door, for the final, damning judgment he knew he deserved. But Martha's eyes flickered past him, toward the mountain where his cabin was hidden, and in their icy depths he saw the image of another woman, alone and in peril, the woman she had once been. "Get my bag," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a truce, dictated by a code older than their grief. The journey back was a silent, tense ordeal. In the cabin, Martha took charge with an air of grim authority. She and Eli moved around Clara's bedside in a strange, unspoken rhythm. Two old enemies bound by a single purpose. He monitored Clara's blood pressure, his movements precise and clinical. Martha worked with herbs and tinctures from her bag, brewing a bitter tea that she gently forced between Clara's lips. He was the modern medic, she the practitioner of old-world wisdom, and in the space between them, a fragile alliance was forged. He would call out a number from the pressure cuff, and she would nod, adding another pinch of herbs to her brew. Clara, drifting on a painful tide of consciousness, watched them through a blur. The faces of these two adversaries, one scarred by fire, the other by grief, swam in her vision. They were a surreal team of saviors, their shared history of loss now repurposed to preserve her life. Slowly, miraculously, the headache began to recede. The pressure behind her eyes lessened. The tide of sickness began to turn. Hours later, Clara was sleeping, her breathing deep and even, for the first time in a day. The immediate crisis had passed. Eli stood by the fire, exhausted, watching the woman who had just worked beside him to save a life. Martha stood near the back room, her rigid posture finally slumping with weariness. Her gaze fell upon the cello case, which leaned against the wall where Clara had left it. She stared at it for a long time, her hard expression softening for the first time. "My husband," she said, her voice rough and quiet, speaking more to the shadows than to Eli. "He used to love music." A fragile peace settled in the cabin in the days that followed. Martha's visit had broken the seal of Eli's isolation, and though she kept her distance, the air between their ranches felt different, charged with a new unspoken understanding. But the world Clara had fled was closing in. Eli spotted them first, two black SUVs crawling up his private road, their polished surfaces a dark, ugly slash against the pristine snow. They were city vehicles, predators far from their natural habitat. He was on the porch before they came to a stop, his stance deceptively relaxed, his presence a silent wall between the strange cars and the cabin door where Clara now stood, her face pale. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened, and Julian Croft emerged. He was exactly as Clara had described. Handsome, impeccably dressed in a cashmere coat that cost more than Eli's truck, his smile perfectly crafted and utterly empty. He looked at the rustic cabin with disdain before his eyes landed on Clara. "Darling," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced balm. "Thank God. I've been half out of my mind with worry." He started toward the porch, but Eli took a single deliberate step forward, blocking his path. Julian's smile tightened. He looked Eli up and down, a dismissive glance that took in the worn jeans, the patched jacket, the burn scar on his arm. "And you must be the local hero," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here to take my fiancée home. We're very grateful for your hospitality." "She's not going anywhere," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "That's not your decision to make," Julian shot back, his mask of civility slipping. He turned his attention back to Clara. "Clara, this has gone on long enough. Your place is with me. Think of the baby, of the life we can give him. Don't throw it all away for this mountain man living in a shack." "Leave, Julian," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not going back." Julian's face hardened. It was clear he'd done his research, that he had come prepared for a fight. He decided to ignore the giant in his path and instead destroy him with words. He took a step back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and aimed his final, poisoned arrow directly at the heart of the man standing in his way. "You really think," he said to Clara, his voice laced with mock pity, "that a man who let his whole crew burn to death can protect you?" Julian's words struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, and for a heart-stopping moment, the giant of a man seemed to shrink, the ghosts of the Grizzly Creek fire rising up to swallow him whole. He was paralyzed by the shame of it, his deepest wound laid bare for the world to see. But then, a movement beside him. Clara stepped forward, her fear replaced by a cold, protective fury. She placed her hand on Eli's scarred arm, a small anchor in his swirling sea of memory, and faced the man she once thought she would marry. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "opened his home to a stranger. He saved my life. He saved our baby's life. That is a kind of honor you will never understand." "Honor?" Julian scoffed, a sneer twisting his handsome features. "This is over, Clara. You're coming with me." He gestured to the man beside him, a burly figure in a black suit who had remained silent until now. The man took a purposeful step toward the porch. Eli's paralysis broke. He moved, placing himself squarely in front of Clara, his body a solid shield. The air crackled with the promise of violence. But before anyone could make another move, a sound cut through the tense standoff, a sound as final and absolute as a judge's gavel, the metallic shuck-shuck of a pump-action shotgun chambering a shell. Everyone froze. Standing 20 yards away, at the edge of her own property line, was Martha Caldwell. She held an old weathered shotgun, and she held it with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Her icy gaze was fixed on Julian. "My husband," she said, her voice carrying across the snow with the force of an avalanche, "trusted this man with his life." She took a step forward, the barrel of the gun never wavering. "That's more than I can say for the likes of you. Now, get off our land." The word hung in the air. Our. It was a declaration, an absolution, a promise. It was the forgiveness Eli had never dared to ask for, delivered in the face of his enemy. Julian stared at the giant in front of him, then at the determined woman with the shotgun, and the cold calculation in his eyes finally gave way to something that looked like fear. He was a man who fought in boardrooms and courtrooms. This was not his battlefield. He backed away, muttering a curse, and scrambled into his SUV. A moment later, the two vehicles were retreating in a spray of dirt and snow, their dark shapes disappearing down the mountain. Eli stood watching them go, Clara's hand still on his arm. Beside them, Martha lowered the shotgun, the sound of the wind filling the sudden, deafening silence. The moment the SUVs disappeared, the adrenaline that had sustained Clara vanished, and her body paid the price. A sharp, searing pain shot through her, making her gasp and clutch her belly. Eli and Martha were at her side in an instant. "It's too soon," Clara panted, another wave of pain crashing over her. But the baby had decided. It was coming now. As if summoned by the crisis, the sky outside darkened with an unnatural speed. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the peaks, a prelude to the coming storm. They got her inside, to the small back room, just as the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the window pane. The storm broke with a primal fury. Wind howled like a freight train, and lightning tore the sky apart, each flash followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations. For Eli, it was more than a storm. The smell of ozone, the percussive booms, the flashing lights. It was the sound and fury of the Grizzly Creek fire all over again. He fought to stay in the present, but the memories clawed at him. A flash of lightning was the hungry lick of a flame through the trees. The roar of the wind was the roar of the firestorm consuming everything in its path. He saw the faces of his men, heard their last shouts over the radio. He was losing his grip, the trauma threatening to pull him under. "Eli!" Martha's sharp voice cut through the roaring in his head. "I need you. Now. Hold her hand, son." The word son was an anchor. He looked at Martha, her weathered face calm and focused, and then at Clara, her face pale with pain and effort, her eyes pleading with him to stay with her. He gripped her hand, his own trembling, and forced himself back from the edge of the inferno. He was a smoke jumper. He held the line. He worked alongside Martha, his past trauma and his medical training locked in a desperate battle. He became her hands, his strength supporting Clara, his voice a steady murmur of encouragement, even as the storm inside him raged. Time dissolved into a blur of pain and fear, and the relentless, violent symphony of the storm outside. Then, at the peak of the storm's fury, as Clara gave one final, desperate cry, it happened. A bolt of lightning struck a pine tree just outside the cabin, and the world exploded in a blinding white flash and an instantaneous, deafening crack. In that stark, silent moment of pure light, as the baby's first cry tore through the air, Eli's ghosts vanished. He didn't see fire or smoke or the faces of the dead. He saw only Clara, beautiful and exhausted, and the tiny, perfect, red-faced infant that lay on her chest. The firestorm had passed. Spring came to the mountains, a season of quiet renewal. The snow retreated, and the valley floor became a carpet of wildflowers. Their daughter, whom they had named Hope, was 3 months old, a tiny, perfect soul who had filled the silent cabin with a new and unfamiliar music. One clear, warm morning, Eli loaded Hope's basket into his truck. Clara followed with a small bundle of wildflowers, and from the neighboring ranch, Martha Caldwell emerged to join them. There was no need for an invitation. It was an unspoken understanding. They drove to a quiet place on the side of the mountain, a small clearing that overlooked the vast, scarred expanse of the Grizzly Creek burn. In the center of the clearing stood a simple granite memorial, a rough-hewn stone bearing the names of 12 men. Eli lifted Hope from her basket, holding her close as he walked to the stone. Clara and Martha stood a respectful distance behind him. He stood before the names of his crew, his lost brothers, for a long time. "Boys," he said, his voice low and rough. "There's someone I want you to meet." He looked down at the baby in his arms. "This is Hope." He then looked over his shoulder at Clara, a look of such profound love and gratitude that it made her heart ache. "This is my family." He ran his fingers over one name etched in the stone. Dave Caldwell, Captain. He turned to Clara, but his words were meant for Martha. "He went back for the rookie," Eli said, his voice clear, not with the ragged edge of guilt, but with the quiet pride of a witness. "The kid was terrified. His shelter wasn't deployed right. Dave's last words to me over the radio were, 'Hold the line, Eli. You don't leave a man behind.'" He was no longer confessing a failure. He was honoring a sacrifice. He was finally telling the story as it should be told. Clara placed her small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. As she straightened up, Martha moved to stand beside Eli. She looked at her husband's name, then at the face of the man who had survived him, and finally at the small child in his arms, the living proof of a future she thought had been stolen from them all. She said nothing. She simply reached out and placed her hand on Eli's shoulder. It was a gesture of shared grief, of profound understanding, and of a peace, finally, blessedly, found. The circle was closed. 1 year later, the ranch was no longer a place of silence. The sound of children's laughter now echoed across the valley, mingling with the low hum of conversation. Eli's land, once a fortress of solitude, had become the heart of the community. A summer barbecue was in full swing, with families from Hope's Landing and the surrounding ranches spread out on blankets in the meadow. Martha Caldwell, her face softer than anyone had seen it in years, sat in a rocking chair on the expanded porch, bouncing a giggling Hope on her knee. Eli stood by the grill, his massive frame relaxed, turning burgers with a quiet contentment. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by the steady, peaceful gaze of a man who had finally come home. He watched his wife, Clara, as she sat with a group of local children, a small violin in her hands, patiently showing a young girl where to place her fingers. She had started a small music program, and in doing so, had brought a forgotten beauty back to the rugged valley. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and purple, people began to pack up, calling their goodbyes. The joyful chaos slowly subsided, leaving behind the gentle quiet of a summer evening. When they were alone, Clara retrieved her cello. She sat on the porch step, the place where Julian had delivered his final cruel blow, and began to play. It was the same Bach sarabande she had played on that first terrible morning, the same melody of sorrow and hope. This time, Eli didn't turn away. He came and sat beside her, settling Hope gently in his lap. He leaned his head back against the porch railing and closed his eyes, not to block out the pain, but to let the music wash over him. The notes no longer spoke of what was lost. They spoke of what had been found. They were the sound of a storm past, of a fever broken, of a fire finally extinguished. The music told the story of a man, a woman, and a child. A new family, built from the ashes, strong and true, and finally at peace. And in the Valley of Hope's Landing, the melody played on. From the ashes of their pasts, Eli and Clara built a new family. We have one simple question for you. Do you believe they truly earned their second chance? If your answer is yes, comment 1 down below. If you believe some wounds are too deep to ever truly heal, comment 0. And if you were moved by their story of courage and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We share powerful new stories every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.